Welcome to This View of Life, where we take a deep dive with the best and brightest thinkers on anything and everything from an evolutionary perspective. I am your host, David Sloan Wilson. For more interviews, articles, videos, and special publications, search for This View of Life on your favorite search engine. Well, hello, this is David Sloan Wilson for This View of Life, and I'm here with Niruban Balachandran and Daniel Glass to talk about a very interesting project of theirs called psychtable.org. Is that right?
That's right.
So, and this is, well, I'll let you describe it. So, what is psychtable.org? And let's describe how you came by it. Introduce yourselves a little bit while we're at it.
So I'm Niruban, and I guess you could say Psychtable is a classification table for evolved psychological adaptations. But beyond that, we want this taxonomy to be collaborative, has to be online, has to be open science, and allows users, especially research scientists in the evolutionary behavioral sciences community, to evaluate and classify these adaptations, evaluating the evidence for these adaptations as well.
Right. Daniel, do you want to add to that?
I'm Dan Glass. I'm a clinical psychologist. A Psychtable to me is, we would like it to be the next big tool, a central reference tool for the human behavioral sciences, for psychology, for neuroscience, for anthropology even. So we view it as cross-disciplinary and open to all.
So how did you come up with this idea? A little bit more about your backgrounds as to how you came up with this very ambitious project.
Well, back in the day, back in 1992, of course, Leda, Cosmides, and Tooby wrote in their sort of seminal work, they wrote, just as one can now flip open Gray's Anatomy to any page and find a description of part of our morphology, we anticipated in about 50 to 100 years that we'll be able to pick up a equivalent reference work for psychology. So we didn't want to wait 50 to 100 years, so we decided to get going on that. Back in 2003, I saw at the HBES conference in Nebraska, Michael Mills had put together a poster on a possible classification table for evolved psychological mechanisms. And that was kind of interesting to me. I also thought that maybe we can go a little bit farther and use, for example, Schmidt and Pilcher's lines of evidence for evaluating whether an evolved psychological adaptation exists. So any of these adaptations can be along the lines of, for example, it could be a trichromatic color vision that Homo sapiens has. It can be thirst. It could be physical pain. It could be lots of different psychological phenomena which were adaptive and helped us during our evolution in terms of reproductive success and so on and so forth. So long story short, I wanted to look at an idea for integrating those lines of evidence into a taxonomy. I submitted a paper in 2011 to the Journal of Social, Cultural, and Evolutionary Psychology. And Dan was on the editorial board. And after it was published, we became good friends and decided to work together on this. And we took it further and we decided to name the taxonomy Psychtable. We put a .org at the end of it, and the rest is history. This is where we are today. Maybe, Dan, feel free to add anything else that I might have missed.
I think you got it there.
Okay, so this very much emanates from evolutionary psychology and the idea that the mind has organs similar to our physical organs. And of course, we all know that ev-psych is a kind of a controversial school of thought within psychology. It has ardent proponents and ardent critics. So the thesis of massive modularity, for example, that would be like, you could see how that might easily lead to a psych table. But yet then there's, I think a lot of people, including a lot of evolutionary psychologists, have backed off of massive modularity to at least some degree. I mean, there's something in there, but what are they? Are they circuits? Are they, what exactly are they? They're not physically located. Typically, they're distributed in the brain and so on. So how does a psych table kind of fit in this controversial area? Is it something that's like wedded to a massive modularity thesis or not?
Great question. So the short answer is no, it's not. And we view psych table as, in large part, a tool to help the field, not just the field of psychology or evolutionary psychology, but the entire discipline, sort of cross-disciplinary domain of human behavioral scientists really adjudicate these types of questions. So the fact that maybe hundreds of massively modular evolved psychological adaptations have been proposed in the literature just means that psych table can have entries on each of those, anything that was proposed. Part of the way psych table works is it aggregates citations of evidence for and also against each of these proposed evolved psychological adaptations, or EPAs, we can call them for short, or evolved mechanisms. So they're all out there in the literature, and people typically argue in the literature or at conferences or in the dining halls of universities whether or not this exists or there's enough evidence for that. Well, what about Dr. Shankar, who found that this doesn't seem to support that? We thought the best way to do this would be to sort of compile it centrally, compile everything, and we know that there are some psychological mechanisms that look like they were evolved through the process of natural selection that most people do not take issue with. For example, thirst, the idea that we have this psychological system that makes us crave and seek out water or fluids to balance our intracellular fluid levels, right? Most people would not disagree with that one. But there are ones like cheater detection that are more controversial, and people say, well, maybe there's some limited studies that show that people are better at detecting social cheating than solving other sorts of logical problems. But there's not good evidence, and if somebody feels that way, then they can contribute to psych table. The countering argument that we'll look at this literature that suggests that we don't have this module, we don't have that module. So the whole, one of the central ways that psych table works is by aggregating all of these different citations that both support and challenge all of these proposed modules. And we think that the field as a whole, the sort of integrated discipline of human behavioral sciences as a whole will be stronger overall if we can really separate the wheat from the chaff. What are the strongly supported adaptations? And what are those that are for which there is not currently good evidence?
Yeah, so I've looked at it myself. I think it's really praiseworthy that way, that you're not really actually committing yourself to any particular position. You're creating a framework basically for it to be debated on a case by case basis. So I think that's really awesome. Maybe what we can do is kind of go through a test run. Let's say somebody wants to propose an evolved psychological adaptation and they want to get it onto the website. What do they do, and what happens then?
Okay, so one of the first stages toward that is to be a curator. So the site is open access, and then anybody can access it, read it, look up anything in the table, make comments. But if they're going to be proposing evolved psychological adaptations that are directly going to be shown on the site, then they go through a little application process where they send in some credentials to show that they somehow have some expertise in the field. Now they can be a psychologist, they can be a philosopher, they can be an anthropologist. We want to see that they have some sort of expertise, and they send us their CV, and our team can make decisions. So we have different levels of access. So once somebody is curator level access, they're able to submit EPAs to psych table. So they go onto the website. They notice that an adaptation that they are interested in isn't on the table yet, and they basically click a link that says, add. They click a button. They're able to go through, input the name of the adaptation. They're able to give it a description, neurolocalization, if they happen to know anything about that, some of the biochemical substrates of the adaptation, what it does, what the proposed function. They put all that information in, and then they're asked to submit at least one citation from the scientific literature that supports that adaptation, that supports the existence of that adaptation. And we can go into a little bit more detail soon about how the submission process of the citations works. It's a little bit involved, but long story short, once they're able to put in at least one citation to show that this has been proposed somewhere, then it's added to the site. Each EPA has a score associated with it. The score is calculated through user ratings, where users rate each individual piece of literature. How strongly does this support or challenge the particular citation, this particular EPA that it's attached to? So when a new EPA goes up on the site table, it's not going to have a very high score. It's going to be on there. And so it's not that a student who wants to know about evolutionary psychology or the brain, the evolved psychological adaptations, would go on the site and say, oh, look, that EPA, it's definitely there in the brain. There's a score associated with it that sort of shows the overall state of the literature as to how strongly the literature supports the existence of this EPA. So that is to say, it's listed on the site, but it doesn't necessarily go into onto the pedestal of, these are the EPAs that we definitely have in our mind, until there is some more evidence that's associated with it in the site table database.
Is there an opportunity to discuss the EPA, any kind of discussion forum or anything like that?
There's a commenting system for each EPA if users would like to have a debate, a discussion about any of these adaptations that have been proposed, and it can be international. And what's important, I think, as well, along the lines of these discussions, is I guess the two criteria that Schmidt and Pilcher have mentioned, which is, of course, evidentiary breadth and then evidentiary depth. So evidentiary breadth is described as how many lines of evidence proposed EPA has. So, for example, how many lines of evidence are there for the EPA that have been underpinned by any of these 8 lines of evidence? Theoretical, psychological, medical, genetic, physiological, phylogenetic, hunter-gatherer evidence, and finally cross-cultural evidence. For example, Brown's list of human universals. And then evidentiary depth is described as the quality of the research studies. So Dan very nicely put together the algorithm for this scoring system. And so given the quality and maybe even the quantity of the research studies that underpin an EPA, discussions can revolve around, for example, if the EPA has high representative sampling across multiple studies, it's likely to be rated as having exemplary evidentiary depth. And if it has fewer than that, or if there's not much research in that domain, then the algorithm would spit out the fact that at this particular time, there's not that great amount of evidence for that particular EPA. So this allows users, researchers, students, whoever they might be, to also see opportunities for research. So, for example, if an EPA has had quite a bit of research done globally across, let's say, 57 countries, but there's not enough evidence that comes from research done in behavioral genetics, then of course that's an opportunity for labs anywhere around the world to look at that as a research opportunity too. So discussions and dialogue can revolve around these domains.
Can you actually access the primary literature through the website?
Yes. So it's going to be linked with the URL. We would like to, as we grow, explore different means of circumventing paywalls, but that's a little bit later on. That involves partnerships with journal publishers and so forth. Right now, if we were to launch it tomorrow, the way it would work is that there would be a URL that would be clickable, and it would take you to the abstract on the publisher's website or whatever.
Right. Yep. So there's copyright issues and things like that to deal with. So this is awesome. I mean, I really would love to see this take off. Here's a question. I think that one of the interesting developments in the study of human evolution is that some adaptations, which more or less everyone assumed must be genetic adaptations, actually turn out to be products of cultural evolution, not genetic evolution. But they've thoroughly been internalized. They're like second nature. Language itself is being discussed this way as less of a genetic adaptation than something which originated as a cultural adaptation. And yes, of course, there was subsequent gene-culture coevolution. The thing about a cultural adaptation is that it might originate in a given culture and not in other cultures. So the idea of being cross-culturally universal is something which is, it's not even true for genetic adaptations if there's local genetic adaptations. So, my question is, can PsychTable handle EPAs, evolved psychological adaptations, except it was cultural evolution, not genetic evolution? Have you thought much about that?
Yes. One of the things that we've been thinking about is some of the more advanced features that we'd like to make PsychTable do as it grows. I'll take one step back from that particular question first to say, some people are going to point out very rightly that even the genetically mediated EPAs aren't the same through the entire lifespan. To deal with that, PsychTable already has we'd like to add a tool, a developmental trajectory tool, basically, to show how this EPA changes over the lifespan. So there's that. There's other sorts of maybe more complex tools that we'd like to add, just like that one. And one of them could be dealing with EPAs. Let's start with first a genetically mediated EPA that allows, cultural evolution to take place. In fact, there are some who would say even adaptations that are purely cultural have to be underlied by some sort of, genetic mechanism that constrains it somehow and shapes it somehow. So starting from there, we haven't developed yet how exactly it would look, but we would like to make sure that we have systems that can cope with eventually looking into an EPA, let's say one for language, for the sake of argument. It's very straightforward to say, here's an entry on PsychTable for the language acquisition device, which, sort of in the traditional old Chomsky sense. And here's the evidence for it, and here's the new evidence against it. And then in a sort of a very basic, sort of genetically mediated, what used to be called sort of innate way. Now we know there's not really too much that's actually innate. Then we could hopefully look at that a little more closely with the more advanced tools that PsychTable will require as it grows. And what are the constraints on this? If language is picked up culturally and there are fewer elements of universal grammar than were initially thought, if that's the case, then what are the constraints? We know that chimpanzees don't learn language in the same way we do. So there are some genetic differences and some cultural differences that are going to play into this. And I think that one of the exciting things about PsychTable for me is that we're not saying here's what PsychTable does, period. What we're saying is here's how PsychTable is beginning, and we would like the help of the entire scientific community, the entire
I get that.
behavioral sciences, right? To really add some of these, to contribute to help us add some of these different features as we go along. So I think the possibilities are very exciting.
Yeah, it doesn't commit itself. I think that's what is exciting about it. You're trying to organize the scientific community. I actually have a case study which is interesting to think about. It is the evolution of lactose tolerance, one of the best examples of gene culture coevolution. What's interesting about it is that keeping livestock culturally originated in separate parts of the world, that set up a selection pressure for lactose tolerance in adults. But the genetic mechanisms, actually were not the same because different mutations and all that. So lactose tolerance, then functionally it's a single adaptation, but mechanistically it's not because it arose basically separately, more than twice as far as I understand it. So how would that PsychTable handle that interesting distinction between something which counts as one adaptation in functional terms, but historically and mechanistically counts as several adaptations, and of course is not a human universal at all.
Right. I love that one. That one, So if there is and I'm sure there is, a psychological adaptation which has evolved through several times through convergent evolution. I don't know a good example off the top of my head, but I know that we know that more studies are going to find this eventually. It sounds like there has to be a feature on Psychtable that is able to indicate somehow that the first origination of this adaptation either predated all modern humans or post-dated, basically happened after the human species was sort of as we know it now, as it looks now. One of the other tools that we would like to develop in the medium term for Psychtable is a phylogenetic or evolutionary sort of trajectory of each EPA. So we would like to be able to look, for example, into thirst. Someone eventually would be able to go to our thirst EPA and say, oh, here's where thirst evolved in phylogenetic history. Here's where we think, however many million years ago, we think the first our ancestor of ours that got thirsty may have arisen. And we would like to be able to do that for these EPAs that have arisen several times through convergent evolution too. We would be able to go to their phylogenies and look at the tree and, hey, look at this. This happened twice, on this continent and in this other population. So that's exciting.
So and this, so I remember back when David Buss published his first edition of his textbook, Evolutionary Psychology. What was so radical about it was that unlike any intro psych textbook, this one was organized around adaptive problems, the problems of kinship, the problems of feeding, the problems of mating, the problems of defense, coalitions, all of these sorts of things. And of course, those were functional categories. It wasn't modular in a mechanistic sense. It was modular in terms of identifying the major problems that existed in the EEA. And it makes me think that, maybe Psychtable should be organized in terms of functional categories as well. Maybe it already is, basically. So it could be, for example, thirst or hunger or mating or so on, remaining agnostic about how many times it evolved, even whether it evolved genetically or culturally. What we do know, what's most on the surface, is that these are things that people had to do in order to survive and reproduce. One way, one how. Some way, somehow they had to do it. And then the mechanisms and the origins and all of that remain to be discovered. So is Psychtable organized according to functional categories as the initial entry of an EPA?
When we were discussing these with the research community, we sort of discovered that there's so many ways to slice and dice this huge array of all these adaptations. And some of the suggestions were along some of your lines, David, in terms of why don't we slice and dice and classify in this table, this classification table, along the lines of functionality. Other folks recommended, for example, when I was at the ISHI conference, they said, well, why don't we just keep it simple and slice and dice these adaptations along the lines of the type of selection. So it ended up being, at this particular time, if you see the 2011 paper, natural selection is class 1, sexual selection is class 2, class 3 is kin selection, and then class 4 at the moment is sort of disputed and uncategorized. For example, EPAs like those which are aligned with religiosity or the moral sentiments might fall into that particular category just because they're so controversial. Even musicophilia or phytophilia, sort of gravitation toward foliage and vegetation. Some scientists say that, well, maybe that could be an EPA that's driven by cultural preferences and cultural evolutions. Others say that that's an evolved preference as well. In any case, we do think that for the functionality, if you look at the 2011 paper, at this particular time, we're looking at coding or classifying at a secondary level functionality. So, for example, EPAs which would be, for example, sexually selected, but they are related to mating, they would probably be shaded a certain color. Those EPAs which are functionally selected, or the selection pressures were for a completely different domain, they would be a slightly different shade of color. But at this time, we're kind of open to what researchers' inputs are. So there's a lot of dialogue about how to organize this classification table, just like the periodic table of elements had a lot of debate and disputes about how to organize the sequencing, the look and the feel and the visual design of the table to make it, well, didactically useful and also useful as a reference tool as well. Dan, anything else to add to that?
Yeah, and I wanted to say that we often use the periodic table as a point of comparison when we're describing to other people on the surface level what psych table is kind of like. But there are problems with the comparison. For obvious example, the periodic table is static, and it's established and non-controversial in terms of the way chemical elements are made up, and we're at a different stage, obviously, in our field. But one of the things that the periodic table does really well is uses several different means of classifying and identifying elements along different lines. So you can tell how many valence electrons are in a chemical element based on its position across the table. You can tell how heavy it is. So there's a lot of different ways. Now, the thing about psych table is that we don't have to be limited to the 2 dimensions of a page anymore, because this is in virtual space. So as we sort of develop the different taxa, the different EPAs that are going to be in the system, as they are added, then all of a sudden we've got all of this data to work with. Who's to say it has to be laid out in a 2-dimensional space? It could be hierarchical. It could be 3-dimensional. It could be 4-dimensional somehow if we're able to visualize it. But the point is that there are a lot of different ways that we can arrange the data on a table. So it's not, it doesn't look like the periodic table anymore. It's something completely different. And yet it is able to show groupings of different adaptive problems, for example, as well as some other elements.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. Well, we could wrap up here. A couple of final questions. Number one, how actively is psych table being used at this moment?
So we have a working, semi-working prototype that's been up for a while to sort of a proof of concept to show people how psych table could work. We took it down recently because right now we're in the midst of a crowdfunding campaign to get a professional web developer to really develop from the ground up a very well-oiled psych table machine. We hired a professional graphic designer, user experience expert to create new wireframes and a new look for the site. So we decided to take the prototype down. So right now we're in the middle of a crowdfunding campaign. When we get a developer, we hope to be able to have something up that will basically allow people to browse, to add, to evaluate citations, and so forth for a lot of different uses that I think Jürgen can outline for us.
Sure, and I also just want to add that in the meantime, we have a senior board of advisors, subject matter experts across a variety of domains. They are psychologists, they're anthropologists, they're biologists, they're other scholars, and they've been very helpful over the last couple of years in sending us ideas for design, for inputs, even EPAs as well. So they've been fairly helpful. In terms of its use, at this particular time, we want to reach the point where we can have a very solid user interface and visual design. So we look forward to launching fairly soon, the sort of next iteration of it. And in the meantime, we are still keeping our eyes out for EPAs which may be proposed and the literature in terms of the evidence that's growing for each one of these EPAs as well. And there are going to be hundreds and hundreds of them. I mean, EPAs by their nature, they are overlapping, they're nested, they're embedded, there's so many nuances to them. So eventually, as the classification scheme and the evaluative scheme evolves, so to speak, we want to make sure to account for those complexities, for example, clusters of EPAs and so on and so forth as well.
Yeah, no, what excites me about it, lots excites me about it, but I think one is, of course, I love all things open source. And so the idea that this can be a community, an open source scientific community, and that's what we're trying to create, is just awesome. And secondly, that it remains open-minded, basically. It doesn't commit itself to any particular school of thought. Is capable of disconfirming any school of thought. It might be genetic, it might be cultural, so on and so forth. It can accommodate the different dimensions of evolution. Tinbergen's 4 questions, mechanism, history, development, function. All of these things can be potentially accommodated, although, of course, it's a daunting task. So very happy to have publicized your project through this interview, and the article that accompanies this interview will point to your crowdfunding site and so on and so forth. And I wish you the very best.
Thank you, David.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to This View of Life. If you like this podcast, you can subscribe in iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Please consider rating it on iTunes and leaving a review to help others find the show. This View of Life is produced by the Evolution Institute, a nonprofit think tank whose mission is to provide science-based solutions for today's most pressing social issues in order to improve the quality of life. Learn more at evolution-institute.org. And if this view of life is important to you, then type TVOL 1000, TVOL 1000, to see how you can join the Darwinian Revolution.